The whispers began as a faint murmur, soft and rhythmic, like someone exhaling in my ear. I froze, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. For a moment I thought I imagined it, but then it grew louder, wet and broken, as though the sound was being dragged through static. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a narrow ribbon flanked by towering pines that seemed to close in the farther I drove. Midnight had stolen every hint of color, leaving only the sharp silver of moonlight slicing through the trees. My headlights struggled against the darkness, barely illuminating the asphalt as the sound burrowed deeper into my head. I rolled the window down, hoping the rush of icy air would shake me out of my growing unease. Instead, it brought an earthy smell, damp and heavy, as though the ground itself had been upturned. I hadn't passed another car in hours. Out here, on Route 93, the world felt abandoned, forgotten. I had told myself the solitude would be calming, but now it was anything but. My chest tightened as the whispers shifted, growing clearer and somehow closer. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my stomach lurching when the dark interior of the car seemed to pulse. An illusion, I told myself, just a trick of the light. Then my phone vibrated on the passenger seat. I jumped, grabbing it quickly, desperate for something real to hold on to. The screen was blank, no calls, no messages. The whispers swelled, surging into something jagged and sharp, each syllable scraping at the edge of understanding. Ahead, the highway dipped toward a bridge. Its iron frame loomed in the moonlight, casting skeletal shadows across the road. Something about it felt off, though I couldn't say why. As my car crept closer, I saw it. A figure, pale and fleeting, darting across the bridge. My breath hitched as I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest. The headlights swept over the road, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The whispers stopped. Silence, so thick it pressed against my ears. But just as I exhaled, relieved, I caught it. Something moving in the rearview mirror. A shadow, just for a moment, shifting behind me. The shadow in the mirror was gone by the time I dared to blink, but the image lingered, burned into my mind. A trick of the light, I told myself, though my body disagreed. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel tighter, the leather cold and unforgiving beneath my fingers. The bridge stretched longer than I expected, its iron frame groaning, as if the weight of my car was too much for it. The air inside the car felt denser, colder, but I resisted the urge to roll the window back down. Outside, the darkness pressed in too close, the kind that felt like it could seep inside if I let it. Then the whispers returned. This time they weren't coming from the back seat or the radio. They were outside. I glanced to my left. Nothing. To my right, shadows flickered just beyond the edge of the bridge, curling like smoke. I kept my eyes on the road, willing my heart to stop its hammering. The sound grew louder, indistinct syllables climbing over each other, each one digging deeper into my ears. I pressed the gas pedal harder, eager to put distance between me and the bridge, but the car resisted, as if the road beneath it was pulling back. Suddenly, a loud thump rattled the car. My breath hitched as I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching against the asphalt. The car jolted to a stop, the headlights cutting through the void. I scanned the road ahead but saw nothing. No debris, no animals, nothing that could explain the impact. When I stepped out, the cold hit me like a wave. My breath clouded in front of me, and for a moment, all I could hear was the faint crackle of cooling metal from the engine. Then a sound. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, approaching from behind. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the bridge, now distant, shrouded in an oppressive black. My skin crawled as the whispers rose again, louder this time, twisting into something almost recognizable. A voice, low and guttural, shaping the edges of my name. Panic surged. I jumped back into the car, fumbling to lock the doors, but the sound followed, curling around me, inside me. And then a laugh, sharp, cutting, unmistakable. The laugh didn't belong. It wasn't human. It slashed through the air, sharp and guttural like glass scraping against steel. I threw the car into drive, tires spinning uselessly on the asphalt for what felt like an eternity before they caught traction. The sound chased me, coiling tighter around my thoughts with every second. As I sped down the road, the car's interior seemed to darken. The dashboard lights flickered, faintly illuminating my trembling hands. Outside, the trees loomed closer, their shapes warping in the periphery of my vision. I blinked hard, willing the shadows to settle into something familiar, but they didn't. Then the headlights flickered. I cursed under my breath, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The whispers had returned, louder now, their unintelligible cadence layered with something new. A rhythmic pounding, like a heartbeat, synchronized with my growing panic. Ahead, the road stretched endlessly, its surface slick and uneven, reflecting fragments of moonlight. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, hoping for reassurance, but all I saw was a thick, impenetrable blackness where the road should have been. And then I wasn't alone. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated briefly by the faltering glow of my headlights. She was pale, almost translucent, her hair clinging to her face as though she had just climbed out of water. Her clothes were torn, hanging loosely from her gaunt frame. I slammed the brakes, the tires screaming as the car skidded to a stop. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I stared at her. She didn't move, her head tilted slightly as though studying me. "Please," I whispered, unsure of what I was begging for. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, her jaw hung unnaturally low, and the whispers erupted from her mouth, deafening, overlapping in a cacophony that rattled my skull. I shut my eyes, gripping my temples as the noise grew unbearable. When I opened them again, she was gone. My heart pounded as I pressed the gas, desperate to leave whatever this was behind. But as the car surged forward, something slammed into the side of it with a force that nearly sent me off the road. My head snapped to the passenger window, where I saw her face again, pressed against the glass, her empty eyes staring into mine. Her mouth moved, but this time no sound escaped. Just a suffocating silence that filled the car like a physical weight. The car veered wildly, the tires skidding on loose gravel as I fought to regain control. My vision blurred, tears streaming down my face as I screamed into the void. When I finally steadied the car, the figure was gone, but the silence remained, heavy and oppressive. The whispers had stopped, but I could feel them still, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting. The road ahead was a blur, my thoughts racing as fast as the car. The figure's face, those hollow, lifeless eyes, was seared into my mind. Even though she was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't left. The whispers returned, softer this time, almost a lullaby. My heart sank as I realized they were coming from everywhere, outside the car, within it, even inside my own head. I gritted my teeth and slammed the steering wheel in frustration. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice breaking. The whispers ignored me. They rose, swelling like a tide, drowning out everything else. My hands trembled as the car's dashboard lights flickered again, then died completely, plunging me into darkness. I struggled to keep my eyes on the road, now barely visible under the faint glow of the moon. And then, as if summoned by the night itself, the bridge reappeared. It wasn't possible. I had driven miles past it, but there it was, stretching endlessly before me, its iron frame glinting in the pale light. My foot hesitated on the accelerator, but the car seemed to move forward on its own, drawn by some invisible force. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of wet soil and decay. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, darting between the trees like restless phantoms. My chest tightened as I realized the shadows weren't random. They were moving closer. A sudden jolt shook the car, and the engine sputtered. I slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. Instead, it crept forward inch by inch until it reached the center of the bridge. The engine died completely. I was trapped. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very steel of the bridge. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the bridge, her back to me, her hair hanging in limp strands. Slowly she turned, her head tilting unnaturally to one side. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Just a deep, resonant vibration that shook the car. The growl grew louder, more insistent, as she began to move toward me. Her steps were slow, deliberate, her gaze locked on mine. My body refused to move, frozen in place by a terror I couldn't explain. The car shook violently as she reached it, her hands pressing against the windshield. Her face loomed closer, her eyes empty but alive with something unspeakable. With a final surge of desperation, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the car lunged forward, throwing her back into the darkness. But as I sped away, I realized the whispers hadn't stopped. They were inside the car now, circling me, laughing softly. The car sped down the road, the tires screeching as I pushed it to its limit. The engine roared in protest, but I couldn't stop. Not here, not with the whispers still circling me. My chest heaved, every breath a fight against the suffocating presence, pressing in on all sides. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see her face again, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching into the night. For a brief moment I thought I was free, and then the laughter returned. It was faint at first, almost a hum, but it grew louder with every mile. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the sound filled the car, wrapping around me like a cold, invisible fog. I tried to drown it out, turning the radio dial frantically, but the static only added to the chaos. The laughter morphed, twisting into a distorted echo of my own voice. "You can't escape," it whispered, the words slithering into my ears like venom. I screamed, my voice cracking under the weight of my terror. The road began to change. The smooth asphalt turned jagged, the car bumping and rattling as it struggled to stay on course. Shadows danced on the periphery, no longer darting but reaching, their shapes stretching toward the car like skeletal hands. And then I saw it again. The bridge. It loomed ahead, its iron frame warped and shifting as though it were alive. My stomach churned at the sight. This wasn't the same bridge I had crossed earlier. It was something else, something wrong. The car slowed on its own, the engine sputtering as if it were being pulled toward the bridge. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, but it was useless. The car coasted to a stop in the middle of the bridge, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I didn't want to look, but something made me. She was there, standing in front of the car, her face pale and hollow. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. I understood. "You belong here," she mouthed. The car's interior lights flickered, and for a brief moment I saw them. Faces, dozens of them, staring back at me from the shadows inside the car. Their eyes were empty, their mouths twisted into unnatural grins. The last thing I remember is the sound of the bridge groaning, the metal twisting under an unseen weight, and then nothing. When I woke up, it was daylight. The car was parked on the side of the road, the engine cold. But the whispers were still there, faint but persistent, just beneath the hum of the wind. I never drove that road again. But even now, in the dead of night, I hear them. Soft, rhythmic, always waiting. The first time I saw her, I almost didn't stop. She stood just beyond the edge of my headlights, her figure shrouded in shadows that clung to her like mist. The desert night had been painfully quiet until then, the kind of silence that wraps itself around you and pulls tight. My truck rumbled softly, the low hum of the engine the only reassurance that I wasn't entirely alone on this stretch of Route 66. Her hand was outstretched, thumb pointing upward in the universal gesture of desperation. Something about the way she stood, stiff and still, made my stomach knot. It wasn't just her isolation or the odd time of night. It was her calm. She didn't wave frantically like most hitchhikers I'd seen on my routes. She waited, unmoving, like she already knew I would stop. I almost didn't. But then the thought of leaving her there alone, miles from any town, gnawed at me. I eased the truck to a stop, the headlights spilling over her like water. Her dress caught my attention first, a deep red, stained and tattered, as though she'd been walking for hours or longer. She approached slowly, her movements unervingly fluid. As she reached the passenger door, I noticed her face. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with a faint, unplaceable sadness in her eyes. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my throat felt tight. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze lingered on the empty highway behind me before she finally said, "Just a little farther up the road." I hesitated but unlocked the door. She climbed in silently, her presence chilling the cabin. I fiddled with the heater, pretending not to notice how the air seemed heavier now, the faint scent of dust and iron creeping in. As I pulled back onto the highway, she spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "There's an accident ahead," she said. "You should slow down." Her words hung in the air, heavy and strange, like they weren't meant just for me. My hands tightened on the wheel. "Are you okay?" I asked, glancing at her. But when I did, she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on something far ahead, something I couldn't see. The hitchhiker's warning about the accident hung in the air, gnawing at my nerves. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, but she hadn't moved since climbing into the truck. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her gaze locked on the horizon ahead. The silence between us was oppressive. I turned on the radio, hoping to drown out my unease, but all I got was static. I twisted the dial, trying to find anything. News, music, even a commercial. But the static persisted. I finally gave up and turned it off, the quiet now somehow louder. "So," I ventured, my voice cracking slightly, "where are you coming from?" For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at me, she said, "I don't remember." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I forced a laugh, trying to shake the growing weight in my chest. "That's unusual. Do you have family nearby?" "No." I gripped the wheel tighter, the leather creaking under my hands. Something about her was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Her clothes, her stillness, her calm, it all felt wrong, like a puzzle with missing pieces. She finally turned to look at me, and her eyes caught the light from the dashboard. For a brief moment, they seemed too bright, too reflective, like the eyes of an animal caught in headlights. "There's an accident ahead," she repeated, her voice steady. "Be careful." The truck hit a bump in the road, jolting us both. I glanced at her again, but she was staring straight ahead, her expression blank. A sign appeared up ahead, illuminated briefly by my headlights. "Caution, dangerous curve ahead." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "How do you know about the accident?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head slowly, staring at me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "You should slow down," she said. I pressed the brakes lightly, the truck groaning in protest. The highway was completely deserted, but the hairs on my arms stood on end, as if we weren't alone. When I glanced back at the passenger's seat, my heart stopped. She was gone. The seat beside me was empty. My chest tightened, my breath caught in my throat. I slammed the brakes, the truck screeching to a stop in the middle of the deserted highway. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. I twisted in my seat, searching the cab frantically. She couldn't have just vanished. The door was still locked, the window closed. There was no way she could have gotten out. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The sound echoed, swallowed quickly by the night. Something shifted in the rearview mirror. My eyes darted to it and I froze. There, in the faint reflection, was the hitchhiker. She stood on the road behind the truck, her figure barely illuminated by the taillights. Her head was tilted, her hair falling like a curtain over her face. I swallowed hard and opened the door, the cold desert air rushing in. "Are you okay?" I shouted, stepping out cautiously. My boots crunched against the gravel as I moved closer to the back of the truck. She didn't respond. She didn't move. As I approached, the air around me grew heavy, thick, with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The headlights of the truck flickered, the darkness creeping closer with every pulse of dimming light. "Miss?" I said again, my voice trembling. She lifted her head slowly, and my blood ran cold. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes reflecting the faint red glow of the taillights. When her lips parted, they moved soundlessly, but I heard her all the same, a low, guttural whisper that curled inside my ears. "Go back," she said. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward. nearly tripping over my own feet. Her figure flickered, fading in and out of view like a poorly tuned signal. I bolted for the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. The moment I turned the key, the headlights flared to life, revealing the road ahead. My stomach dropped. There was another vehicle, a mangled wreck sitting across the highway, its front end crumpled and its windows shattered. The ghostly outline of smoke still hung in the air, as if the accident had just happened. But the strangest part wasn't the car. It was the figures standing around it. A group of shadowy silhouettes circled the wreck, their movements slow and deliberate. They turned as one toward the truck, their faces obscured but unmistakably watching me. I jammed the truck into reverse, tires screeching as I backed away. The hitchhiker was gone, but her voice lingered in my ears. You can't outrun it. The truck skidded as I reversed down the road, the shadowy figures in the distance moving closer. My heart thundered in my chest, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The hitchhiker's voice echoed in my head, her words weaving into the low hum of the engine. I glanced at the rearview mirror, searching for an escape route. The open desert sprawled on either side of the highway, but the darkness beyond the headlights felt alive, pulsating with unseen threats. When I looked back at the wreckage, the figures were gone. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The truck lurched violently as though something had slammed into the back of it. I cried out, gripping the wheel as the vehicle shuddered to a stop. And then the laughter began. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. Soft, mocking, slipping through the cracks of the truck's cab. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, burrowing into my thoughts like a parasite. You shouldn't have stopped. Her voice cut through the laughter, sharp and accusing. I whipped my head toward the passenger seat, and there she was. The hitchhiker sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her head tilted just enough to meet my gaze. You didn't listen, she said. I tried, I stammered, my voice barely audible. What do you want from me? Her lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. It's not about what I want, she whispered. The truck's lights flickered again, plunging the cab into brief darkness. When they came back on, she was gone. But I wasn't alone. The shadowy figures from the wreckage now surrounded the truck, their faces obscured by an unnatural haze. One by one, they pressed their hands against the windows, their movements slow and deliberate. The glass fogged under their touch, leaving streaks that formed strange, jagged symbols. I tried to start the truck, but the engine groaned and sputtered. The air in the cab grew colder, the metallic tang of blood filling my nose. Through the windshield, I saw her again. The hitchhiker stood in front of the truck, her eyes locked on mine. Her mouth moved, but the words didn't come from her lips. They came from all around me, whispered in 100 overlapping voices. Stay. The words struck like a hammer, freezing me in place. My vision blurred, my body trembling as the figures outside began to pull at the truck, rocking it violently. With a surge of desperation, I turned the key one last time. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas, the truck lurching forward. The hitchhiker didn't move as I sped toward her, her figure dissolving into mist just before I reached her. The road ahead was clear, but the laughter followed. The highway stretched endlessly before me, a thin ribbon of pale asphalt cutting through the darkness. The truck roared beneath me, its engine straining as I pushed it harder, desperate to leave the wreckage, and her behind. But the road didn't feel right. It didn't feel real. The hitchhiker's laughter had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the wheel, refusing to glance in the rearview mirror. I couldn't bear to look back. It wasn't until the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon that the tension in my chest eased. The barren desert, painted in muted hues of orange and gold, felt like salvation. I pulled the truck to the side of the road, cutting the engine and collapsing against the steering wheel. My body trembled, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I was alive, or so I thought. As I sat there, I noticed something strange. The passenger seat, where she had been, wasn't empty. A faint red stain darkened the fabric, its edges jagged and uneven, as if something had seeped through it. My heart sank as I reached out to touch it, the fabric cold and damp beneath my fingertips. The laughter returned, soft and distant, carried on the desert breeze. I scrambled out of the truck, the door slamming shut behind me. The rising sun cast long shadows across the ground, but something about them didn't feel right. They were too sharp, too deliberate. I glanced down at my arm, and my stomach dropped. Then jagged scratches crisscrossed my skin, forming a pattern I couldn't recognize. The lines were faint, but unmistakable, as though they'd been etched there by invisible hands. "You can't leave," her voice whispered, carried on the wind. I spun around, but the road was empty. No figures, no wreckage, just the endless stretch of Route 66. I didn't finish the delivery that day. I didn't take that route again. But the sound of her voice still finds me in the dead of night, soft and rhythmic, whispering from somewhere just out of reach. And no matter how far I drive, no matter how fast I go, I know she'll always be there, waiting. The scream wasn't human. It tore through the thick fog like a jagged blade, sharp and guttural, making me jerk the wheel. The truck swerved, tires screeching as I struggled to keep it on the road. My pulse pounded in my ears as I straightened out, the endless stretch of the highway barely visible in the glow of the headlights. The fog was everywhere, thick and choking, swallowing the road and everything around it. I hadn't seen another car for miles. Not surprising, given the time of night and the remote location. This coastal stretch of Maine was known for its desolation, but tonight it felt worse. It felt alive. I rolled down the window, hoping the cold sea air would clear my head. Instead, it brought a bitter, briny smell that clung to the back of my throat. I shivered, suddenly hyper-aware of the silence outside. There were no waves crashing against the cliffs, no wind rustling through the trees. Nothing. The scream came again, closer this time. It was high-pitched and desperate, rising and falling like someone, or something, being dragged underwater. My breath hitched as I scanned the road ahead, but all I could see was fog, swirling like it had a mind of its own. I considered turning back. My shift at the docks had been brutal, and all I wanted was to get home, but something about the road ahead felt wrong. Still, the thought of doubling back and taking the longer route through town didn't sit well either. As I hesitated, a shape darted across the road, just at the edge of the headlights. I slammed the brakes, the truck lurching to a stop as I strained to see through the fog. There was nothing. I leaned forward, my heart pounding, my fingers gripping the wheel so hard they ached. The fog thickened, wrapping around the truck like a cocoon. For a moment I thought I saw movement, shadows shifting in the mist, but when I blinked, they were gone. Then, far ahead, the scream came again, louder, closer, and this time it sounded like my name. I stayed frozen, gripping the wheel as the echo of the scream faded into the fog. My name. I was sure of it. I told myself it wasn't real. The mind plays tricks, especially out here, surrounded by nothing but fog and silence. But deep down, I knew better. There was something unnatural about that sound, something that dug under my skin and wouldn't let go. Shaking my head, I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. Turning back wasn't an option. I was too far from town, and the idea of retracing my path through the fog sent a shiver down my spine. No, the best thing I could do was keep driving. The truck rolled forward, its headlights slicing through the mist. I stayed tense, my eyes darting to the edges of the road where shadows danced just out of reach. At first I thought they were tricks of the light, but the longer I stared, the more I saw. Shapes that shifted and darted, too quick and deliberate to be random. Then the headlights caught something on the road. At first it looked like debris, a pile of tangled branches or seaweed, but as I got closer, my stomach churned. It wasn't branches. It was the body of an animal, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its fur matted and slick with something dark. I slowed the truck, my instincts screaming at me to keep moving, but curiosity won out. Against my better judgment, I stepped out, the cold air hitting me like a wave. The body was worse up close. It wasn't just mangled, it was wrong. The legs were too long, the neck bent at an impossible angle, the fur bristling like it was still alive. A sound behind me made my blood run cold. A faint rustling, like footsteps on wet grass. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the truck idling softly in the fog. The air grew heavier, the bitter, briny smell stronger now. My chest tightened as the rustling came again, louder this time, followed by something else. Breathing, shallow, labored, just behind me. I whipped around again, but the road was empty. The scream came once more, closer than ever, and I didn't hesitate this time. I scrambled back into the truck, slamming the door and locking it. My hands shook as I pressed the gas, desperate to leave whatever this was behind. But as I drove on, the fog only grew thicker, and I wasn't sure I was alone anymore. The fog thickened, swallowing the road and the truck in one suffocating gulp. I leaned forward, gripping the wheel as if holding on tighter would somehow pierce the haze. The scream still echoed in my head, a haunting reminder that something was wrong. I turned on the high beams, but they didn't help. The light reflected off the fog, creating a glowing wall of white. The road had vanished beneath me, and I was driving blind. Then I saw it. A figure, shrouded in mist, standing in the center of the road. My heart stopped as I slammed the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. The tires screeched, the sound tearing through the dense silence. The figure didn't move. I stared, my breath fogging up the inside of the windshield. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. They were drenched, their clothes hanging in wet, heavy folds. Their head was tilted slightly, as if they were studying me, but I couldn't make out their face through the mist. I rolled down the window a crack. "Are you okay?" I called, my voice trembling. The figure raised an arm, pointing toward the road ahead. "Don't go," they said, their voice hoarse and uneven, like it hadn't been used in years. "You won't make it back." A chill ran through me, colder than the fog. "What are you talking about?" They didn't answer. Their arm fell to their side, and they stepped forward. I panicked, throwing the truck into reverse, but before I could move, they vanished. One moment they were there, the next, the fog swallowed them whole. The cab grew colder, the air heavy with the scent of salt and decay. I glanced at the side mirror, half expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I saw something worse. A handprint. It was smeared across the glass, long and jagged, as if it had been dragged along the surface. My stomach twisted as I stared at it, the faint outline of fingers too long, too thin to be human. My pulse thundered as the truck shuddered, rocking gently, as though something had climbed onto it. The sound of breathing returned, heavy and wet, coming from somewhere above me. I couldn't take it anymore. I floored the gas, the truck lurching forward into the fog. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the mist swallowing everything behind me. But I wasn't alone. In the rearview mirror, the figure appeared again, sitting in the bed of the truck, their head tilted, their hollow gaze fixed on me. They didn't move, but the scream came again, louder than ever, shaking the truck as if it came from inside. I drove faster, desperate to escape, but the fog grew darker, thicker, and I couldn't tell if I was driving forward or in circles. The truck rattled violently as the scream tore through the air, louder and closer than ever. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a force shaking the cab and pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white as the road ahead began to shift. The fog swirled with a mind of its own, forming shapes that flickered and dissolved too quickly to fully grasp. Shadows stretched and twisted, their movements synchronized with the rising wails that surrounded me. And then I saw them. Figures emerged from the fog, dozens of them, their outlines faint and flickering. They moved with an eerie fluidity, their forms indistinct yet undeniably human. Some staggered as if carrying an unbearable weight, while others seemed to glide across the road, their feet never touching the ground. The truck slowed. I didn't press the brake, but the engine groaned, resisting my attempts to accelerate. The figures closed in, their faces still hidden by the mist, but their presence was suffocating. "Stop," a voice whispered, low and guttural, cutting through the chaos. It was her voice. The figure from the road appeared ahead, standing in the truck's path. This time there was no doubt. She wasn't alive. Her skin was pale and waterlogged, her hair clinging to her face in wet strands. She raised a hand, her hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You need to see," she said, her voice layered with echoes, as if others were speaking through her. The truck came to a halt. My hands trembled as I tried to restart the engine, but the key refused to turn. The scream erupted again, this time accompanied by a vision. The world around me shifted. The truck disappeared, replaced by jagged cliffs and a churning sea below. I wasn't in the cab anymore. I was on the edge of the precipice, the wind howling in my ears. I saw them then, the ghostly figures from the fog. They were gathered on the cliffside, their faces now clear. Each one was twisted in pain, their mouths frozen in eternal screams. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge, her back to the sea, her arms outstretched as two shadowy figures loomed behind her. With a violent shove, they pushed her into the abyss. Her scream rose above the crashing waves, piercing and eternal. The vision dissolved, and I was back in the truck, the fog pressing in from all sides. "You'll join us," the voice whispered in my ear. The truck began to move on its own, rolling forward toward a bend in the road. My heart raced as I realized what lay ahead. The edge of the cliff loomed closer, and the brakes refused to work. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fog. I woke to sunlight streaming through the windshield. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. The truck was parked on the side of the road, the engine silent, the cab bathed in the soft golden glow of morning. The fog was gone, replaced by clear skies and the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs. But something wasn't right. My body ached, every muscle tense, as though I'd been gripping the wheel for hours. The air inside the truck was cold, and the faint scent of salt still clung to my clothes. When I glanced at the passenger seat, my breath caught. There was a handprint on the window, long and jagged, the fingers too thin and too sharp to be human. I scrambled out of the truck, my legs shaky, as I stood on the uneven gravel. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, empty and quiet. For the first time, I noticed deep scratches along the sides of the truck, as if something had clawed at it during the night. I turned toward the cliffs, drawn by a feeling I couldn't explain. The sea churned far below, its waves crashing violently against the jagged rocks, and then I heard it again, the scream. It was faint, almost lost in the roar of the ocean, but it was there, carried on the wind like a ghostly echo. My stomach twisted as the events of the night rushed back to me. The fog, the figures, her voice. "You'll join us," she had said. I stumbled back to the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it, though I wasn't sure what I was trying to keep out. My hands trembled as I started the engine, the sound breaking the eerie stillness. As I drove away, the road felt different. The smooth asphalt beneath the tires seemed wrong, unfamiliar. In the rearview mirror, I could swear I saw shadows flickering in the distance, their shapes curling and shifting like smoke. I didn't take that highway again, but the screams never left me. I hear them in my dreams, calling my name, begging me to return. And I know one day I will.
If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to let us know in the comments which story kept you up at night. Your feedback inspires us to create even more haunting adventures. Hit that like button to support the channel, share this video with your friends who love a good scare, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another eerie encounter. And hey, if you have your own creepy story, drop it in the comments. We might feature it in a future video. Finally, check out the videos popping up on your screen right now for even more spine-tingling content. Trust me, you don't want to miss them. Stay safe and sleep well.